Also in terms of finding an evaluation criteria, how do we do that? What's the right kind of instrument that will work in the Jamaican case? Does it have to be one that's unique to schools, or should it be across the board kind of evaluation criteria? The other question that came up, an issue that came up, had to do with leadership and resources. These are things that we can't get away from. I mean, in a small country like ours, we obviously have a resource constraint, but the fact is that in order for us to elevate the level of education that we have here, obviously the resource question and the leadership question has to be answered. In relation to incentives, we've pretty much agreed that they solve the principal agent problem, as you had put it. But there are also, as you had said, there are many flavors to incentives, and that's one thing that's coming out. How do we really find the right kind of mix for incentives? And even the literature really does demonstrate that there's no one way or one avenue towards setting up these incentives. And there's even the question that came up about what's the role of school boards? I mean, we were discussing a lot of these issues and thinking, oh, it's just a principal. But there's a role for the board, there's a role for the ministry, there's a role for the principals. And there needs to be much more collaboration and consensus building in relation to this very important issue. And so I thank you again. It's been a wonderful session. And I know the rest of the sessions for the day will go as well as this one did. But I have to end with some logistical details. There are two of them. On your evaluation forms, this session was missing. And I know you all want to write about how wonderful this session was, and there's no space for it. So please write it at the back of your paper.
It's been a very, very interesting discussion so far, and we're going to continue with it throughout the afternoon. And one of the things I intend to do before the end of the day is to come up with concrete proposals for what, you know, at meetings, of course, they call actionable items. What are the things that we will do coming out of this? I've got one or two proposals I intend to make, but if anybody else has proposals, the complaint in Jamaica is always there's so much talk, there's not enough action, the time for action is now. And I think on education, probably people can agree on that very point. Education is something we value very highly. Now, we're very, very grateful to have the presence of the Minister with us today, along with the past Minister and the opposition spokesman. So we have a very august crowd to join all the very impressive minds that we have assembled in one room. So I think if we can't come up with actionable items by the end of the day, we really will have failed in our task. And I am absolutely confident that that won't be the case. Now, speaking of the Minister, one of the things I find in Jamaica is that the less a person needs an introduction, the more introduction we give them. So I am going to actually break with that tradition, because quite truly Andrew Holness doesn't need an introduction. He is well known to everybody and has been for years. He is, of course, the current Minister of Education, an alumnus of the University of the West Indies, and I would add St. Catherine High School, which I would simply put in not being a St. Catherine alumni myself, but I think it is a school that has actually produced quite a lot of bright people quietly over the years, so I would note that. Was a special assistant to the Most Honourable Edward Siaga at the Premium Group of Companies until 2000, and then from 1994, previous to that, 94 to 96, he was Executive Director of the Voluntary Organization for Uplifting Children. And the media hounds here will also probably know him, possibly some of you will know him best of all, as a former co-host of The Breakfast Club. Once again, that is not shameless self-promotion. I left The Breakfast Club years ago, but I think Kim Marie Spence probably fit that one into the introduction. And finally, of course, he's the current Member of Parliament for West Central St. Andrew. But needless to say, the reason he is here today is in his role as the Minister of Education at a very interesting time. You only had to have read the papers yesterday to realize just how very topical the issue of accountability in education is at the moment and how important it is to this minister. So he very kindly has agreed not only to give a short talk, but to throw open the floor for question and answer, and I invite you all to pepper him with questions, because here is an opportunity for all of us, as I say, to reach some kind of actionable future. And so I invite you all to really take advantage of that. Minister?
It is my great pleasure to be here today amongst so many educators. The matter before us is one of extreme importance. When I took the portfolio as Minister of Education, and I started to review the transformation proposals, the transformation task force report, one of the principles outlined in the report was that of decentralization of the education system. And decentralization makes sense. It is an efficient means of managing large undertakings, such as an education sector. The principle of putting authority where decisions have to be taken, moving authority to the front line of the decision-making process, is a very solid principle. But my fear, having reviewed the task force report and the recommendations, was that if you push authority from the center to the front line, and there is no system of holding the persons who you push that authority to in the front line, holding them accountable for delivering the results, then your system will fail. If your system was failing in the first place because power was concentrated in the center, if you push that power to make decisions to the periphery, it will fail if the persons who you give the authority to don't have a system of accountability. Now, the question must be asked, where does that system of accountability come from? There are two views in my mind about accountability. One is that accountability is something that you enforce. So then the center has a role, the central ministry, whether it is a policy ministry or a regulatory body in the policy ministry, has a role to regulate and enforce standards for accountability on the persons who you have decentralized and devolved authority to. That is one view, and the Ministry of Education will have to develop accountability matrices to deal with that issue. But today, I want to focus on another view of accountability, and that is the whole business of compliance by virtue of believing in the standard set. People holding themselves accountable. And that is a challenge that we're going to face. And I think that is the challenge we're going to face in terms of dealing with the culture of non-accountability that pervades our society. So we start in the education system by trying to give information to our teachers, educate our teachers about their roles and responsibilities. That's the first thing. So when the question is asked, how do we intend to bring accountability to the system? My first answer, it is not by some mechanisms of enforcement.